Linux doesn't matter. Ultimately, my goal is software freedom. So, in this speech, I will be talking about competitors to Linux. Now, why would you want to avoid the Linux kernel? Well, who knows, you may have many reasons, but let's pose a hypothetical scenario for the future. Perhaps someday some big tech completely takes over the development of the Linux kernel and it is directed into some direction where it's just not good anymore and people need to switch away from the Linux kernel. And people who still want to use free software, but the Linux kernel has been made unusable to the people. What are their options? This is not an unreasonable scenario, and it is a really big thing that people have to consider. We cannot predict the future, and also it is a known fact that people like Linus Torvalds himself, he doesn't care about software freedom. Linus Torvalds has many times stated that the reason he went with the GPL license is because of the technical nature of the license, what results from choosing the license, because people are forced to contribute their source code. So it was a technical reason. It was about technology. Linus Torvalds wanted everyone to contribute the source code, so he chose a copyleft license. So Linus Torvalds himself already alone doesn't really care about software freedom. He was never concerned with the freedom of the users. So not only is the leader of the Linux kernel himself not someone who is interested in software freedom, but who is to say what happens in the future? You really cannot, it can't be guaranteed, you cannot rely on the Linux kernel to be forever a good kernel. It might become really bad. Okay, so anyway, now with that out of the way, let's get into the options. Well, most notably, there are already somewhat well-known options like the BSD operating system, so let's start with that. Operating systems like FreeBSD or OpenBSD, they are derivatives of the BSD systems from back in the old days. The BSD systems, they are licensed under permissive licenses. Permissive licenses are not the best licenses, they are technically bad, and also they are ethically poor because they don't guarantee users freedom. In fact, that is a problem for many of these options, but not for all of them. Anyway, BSDs, they have a solid operating system. They are basically like, if you think about BSDs, the difference between BSDs, let's just say FreeBSD for example. The difference between FreeBSD and the, let's say, GNU plus Linux is that FreeBSD is a direct derivative of Unix, so it is like an authentic Unix system, other than it doesn't have the name Unix because of trademark things, but technologically, FreeBSD is an authentic Unix basically, so whereas something like GNU plus Linux, the design philosophy is different and also people take it into different directions, where FreeBSD is like, it is very centralized and very specific and has kept its Unix ways. So like it's a single project. There's a single FreeBSD project and they develop that operating system. There aren't distributions, many of them, that drive the development into different directions and all that. Anyway, FreeBSD is like an authentic Unix. In practice, for a desktop user, for a desktop computer user, FreeBSD might feel like something that's like old, like it's behind the development of GNU plus Linux. It's outdated, it's old, and that is in some ways quite true. The development has been quite slow, but there are benefits and disadvantages to the way it is. You can use FreeBSD for the most part, and if the Linux kernel ever becomes a bad kernel, FreeBSD is one option to consider. Now, OpenBSD is a really weird operating system. I guess it also can be used, but it more so seems to advertise itself as being like this security-oriented operating system for like I don't know. I guess you could do some network stuff with that, and such things. It can be used as a desktop, of course, but from when I've tried it, it's not really the best. It's really clunky and quite difficult on a desktop. But anyway, FreeBSD is at least a solid option. The package repository is immense. There's a lot of software in the repository. In fact, I'm not exactly sure about the numbers, but from what I've gathered and the feel I get is that like FreeBSD might even have way more software on its package repository than something like Debian. Like it has a lot of software. Like it has many obscure programs that are not on GNU plus Linux in repositories. Now, sure, there's something like perhaps the ARX with its AUR thing and whatever, who knows. And of course, the software is always available somehow through some means, but I'm specifically talking about the repository. The repository itself has a lot of software, and this is not even counting the ports. There's a lot of software on FreeBSD, and also FreeBSD has a compatibility layer with running Linux kernel binaries, so it can have those also run. So software compatibility is not software availability is not an issue on FreeBSD, at least. There may be some hardware driver limitations which lag behind the Linux kernel. So some hardware might not have some drivers or whatever, but FreeBSD is a solid option for at least if you get the hardware right and you are fine with the development model of very slowly releasing software, then FreeBSD is one good consideration. Yeah. So that's the first. Well, I don't know if it's really a recommendation, but that's the first option. Now let's get to the second option. I'm gonna put here the OpenSolaris derived illumos based operating systems, which let's see, for example, OpenIndiana is really the big one, but who knows what might happen in the future. For example, I just very recently, just now, came to my knowledge that the operating system called Chaos, I don't really know how that is pronounced. It's the KDE operating system. They have their KDE stuff. So they are apparently considering using the illumos kernel. So perhaps one day they might start using the illumos kernel. So this is the OpenSolaris based kernel that the OpenIndiana also uses. So there might be some distributions of the illumos and such out in the future. There are already some distributions, but many of them are like server and like network attached storage things and whatever. There are distributions of illumos, but they are not really desktop purposes, and also many of them are proprietary too, so that's bad. Avoid proprietary software, of course. Proprietary software is bad, but if you just stick to the free Libre operating system distributions, there are at least there's at least the OpenIndiana. OpenIndiana is the current big one you can use right now, and then in the future, who knows if there are more distributions, more distributions show up and other operating systems adopt the kernel, like Chaos, for example, could adopt the illumos kernel, which I might even recommend they do. I don't really know if anyone of them would care about my opinion, but yeah, I'd say that would be a pretty cool idea. Yeah, so the illumos, they derive from the OpenSolaris. So OpenSolaris is a variant, or basically just Solaris from back in the day, from Sun Microsystems, and the Solaris, that's like a really that's like one of those System 5 whatever releases of Unix. So like that's like one of the most true Unix, like that, if anything, is like an authentic Unix. So that is like the most Unix there is, basically like one of the main big Unix lines. So the Sun Microsystems had their Solaris operating system, and then they released it as free software called OpenSolaris. OpenSolaris under that name. But then the Oracle bought the Sun Microsystems, and then they of course terminated the OpenSolaris project because, well, of course. Anyway, fortunately there were some people who forked the OpenSolaris and renamed it to illumos. So basically illumos is just a direct continuation of OpenSolaris, just under a different name. And then there are distributions of illumos, such as OpenIndiana. So the technology and all the features that the illumos-derived systems have, such as OpenIndiana, are of course those of the Solaris. So you get all that Solaris software, all that good stuff, such as the ZFS file system. The ZFS file system is like, it is the best file system ever. There is no better file system than a ZFS. ZFS, that is the ultimate file system that I'm aware of anyway. It is the best. So there are all kinds of interesting Solaris technologies that are in the kernel. So let's look at the OpenIndiana more specifically. If the Linux kernel goes bad one day, then is OpenSolaris-based operating system such as OpenIndiana a good option? Well, yeah, sure. You know, the hardware, for one, first would really be a big issue. Seemingly the OpenIndiana doesn't necessarily like that much hardware. It might have some... It might struggle to run on some hardware from my understanding, that it's not really... It doesn't really like many hardwares. You know, as far as I'm aware, the illumos-based systems, they get even less attention than what the BSD systems would get. So of course the GNU plus Linux gets the most development and most attention from like all the tech people. BSD is less than that, and like illumos even less than that. So illumos, you can have a functional operating system. You can use it as a desktop. Like if you're just like some general person who just uses your operating system as just like browse some web browsers and use some Office software, like yeah, it can do that. It's a desktop operating system. It can be used. It's basically just well, I guess like currently the software might not be like in the best, like the releases might not be the highest, newest versions, and I don't exactly recall the software availability, but from what I remember, it's somewhat poor, at least compared to like BSD. BSD can basically run all those compatibility layers. FreeBSD specifically. FreeBSD can run all those Linux kernel binary compatibility layers and all that stuff, so like the software availability is not an issue on the FreeBSD system, but OpenIndiana doesn't really have those things. OpenIndiana's development has been like really very slow, almost non-existent as far as I'm aware. Not sure. I'm sure there's some development there, but like it gets even less attention. It gets even less attention than something like BSD, and BSD is already pretty unpopular compared to GNU plus Linux. So OpenIndiana is like really unpopular. So it's like very obscure. So you might have some practical difficulties. But if we assume that if the Linux kernel goes really bad in the future, like let's say a sizable portion of the user base of the Linux kernel, they decide to leave Linux behind and go somewhere else. Now I'm sure that these developers will then start contributing to like the illumos kernel and the FreeBSD systems and all that stuff. So perhaps we can assume that the software availability might also with that like increase, because the people get disenchanted with the Linux kernel, so they no longer want to target that specifically, so more developers go to the illumos systems too. So something like that could be thought about. Yeah, you might have some difficulty. The software availability is not the best, and it's a bit old too, because like the development has been really slow, and it's already like, I don't exactly remember the year anymore, but like I think it was like 2010 when Oracle bought the Sun Microsystems and then terminated the OpenSolaris. So the development has been really slow from ever since. And yeah, so it could be used if you can get the hardware right, and you have some use cases where you have all the software you need in there. So it could work for like some general purpose use, like yeah, sure, I guess it could work. Yeah, sure, whatever. It's not the best option, but it could be considered, it could be looked into. If it works, you can use that. And also, who is to say, maybe in the future it will really pick up its pace. The development might increase, because like, the foundation is solid. It's really just a matter of like, well, if the hardware doesn't work, like that's just a matter of like the drivers and such. If people just make the drivers for that operating system, if the user base grows enough, then companies might decide to make drivers for it. So yeah, those sorts of problems can be solved, and software availability, well, that's just a matter of like pumping out some content for it. Yeah, if some developers start paying attention more to the illumos stuff, then yeah, those sorts of things, they can happen, and easily do, because the foundation is really solid. Like I said, for example, the ZFS file system, that is the best file system ever, and that's no coincidence. That comes from the Sun Microsystems people. They made that operating system basically. That's like technologically that is one of the highest like best quality software out there when it comes to operating systems, because it was made by the Sun Microsystems people, of all people. Yeah, those people were some good operating system software developers. So the foundation, it is really solid, and the technology is really high quality. So you could really easily, it's just a matter of how many people contribute to it and make software for it and all the drivers for it. It's just a matter of that. But if there is the people who make that stuff, then illumos could really pose a big competitor for the Linux kernel. Now there is one big problem, the license. The license is the CDDL license. Common Development and Distribution License, I believe, was the name of that license. It is like a really weak copyleft. So if I remember correctly, it has some copyleft in the distribution of source code. So if you distribute source code, you have to retain the license. So it's like source code copyleft. But you can take the binary and distribute that as proprietary. So yeah, it's kind of a weak copyleft. Now, I don't like these permissive licenses. I've already made many speeches in the past explaining my dislike for permissive licenses, and I guess I would include weak copyleft, such as the CDDL license, as being in the same camp, because they both suffer from the same problem. Yeah, because there's the technical reason. I've already made a separate speech for that. Why it was the speech about why fragmentation of software is good, as long as it's copyleft. So as long as the software is copyleft, then fragmentation is good. That was the topic of that speech. In that speech, I describe how BSD and permissive licenses in general are inferior to copyleft. So that's the technological side. But then there's also the ethical one, and I've also made a separate speech about that one. That topic, that's the why permissive licenses are evil or bad or whatever. So that's that speech. So I've already made those, and I've of course mentioned this issue on some other speeches, I guess, briefly or something. Whatever. Anyway, those two big speeches primarily. So yeah, I'm not gonna repeat what I've said in those speeches here, right now. So you can go listen to those speeches. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, the permissive licenses, including weak copyleft licenses, they are bad. If the operating system uses those, it does suffer from a problem. So it's not the competitivity against the Linux kernel being copyleft. It is weak. It's not the best competitor. If the license was changed to a copyleft license, that alone would increase the competitiveness of these other operating systems compared to the Linux kernel. In fact, I could argue that if the illumos people were to relicense their software under the copyleft, they might even end up getting some bigger contributions to it, because like I already mentioned, there are proprietary illumos-based operating systems, and that's of course a bad thing. So yeah, refer to those 2 big speeches I made. Mainly the fragmentation is good for this. Well, it's a bad thing to have those proprietary distros. Anyway, so yeah, that's that. But other than these issues of the license, illumos has a really solid foundation, so it can pose a really big threat to the Linux kernel if it gets the attention and the development contributions it needs. So now let's move on to the third and final option to the Linux kernel. And also, I didn't mention this earlier, but I specifically want to keep this list as being Unix-like only. I'm not gonna talk about operating systems that are not Unix-like, because they are not really replacements for the Linux kernel and for the users who like GNU plus Linux and all things Unix, because, well, if you could always just switch to something else entirely, that kind of defeats the point of, like, having these different options. Anyway, the third option, who knows how this might go, but the future will determine what happens with this one, but the Hurd kernel. The Hurd kernel is one of the only few microkernel-based operating system kernels out there that are, like, in any serious usable state. And if the Linux kernel is to become really bad one day, and some people decide to start to contribute to the Hurd kernel, that thing, when it comes out of all of the alpha and such beta and whatever, who knows, development stages, once the Hurd kernel gets out of that and becomes a release version, and it's usable, and some distros like Debian and GUIX, GNU distributions like Debian and GUIX, they take that Hurd kernel and implement it in their operating systems, that thing is going to have some serious punch, because it's a microkernel design. So for this thing, this is highly dependent on how things go in the future. The other operating systems that I've mentioned thus far, like FreeBSD for example, they already have a solid. They are already solid and usable. You can already pick them up and go. You can pick up and go with those already right now. Even if the Linux kernel never goes bad, you can already start using FreeBSD and just go with that. It already works. But GNU's Hurd is not in that state. The kernel and the GNU distributions that would use it, such as Debian and GUIX, they are not ready yet. They are very much developmental software. So only the future will determine how this goes. But the reason I include it in this list is because the potential is there. The potential is there and it cannot be ignored. Out of people, foolish, short-sighted people might look at the Hurd kernel and say, well, it has been in development for, 30 years now, and it hasn't gotten out of developmental stages yet. It must be useless and a bad kernel. No one would ever use that. But here's the thing. Who said that software has to be released really quickly for it to be good software and have the potential to be really good software? Who said that it has to be released really quickly? If it takes a long time to develop something, that is a side effect of, that is a product, a result of things like the software being difficult to work with, perhaps because of advanced design architecture, and also the big competitor that is the Linux kernel. If most of the people are interested in that Linux kernel and contribute to that, it of course results in people neglecting the Hurd kernel and the development slowing down. So there are many reasons why the Hurd kernel would have been developing really slowly. But that doesn't mean that the design architecture itself is bad or inferior to something like the Linux kernel. In fact, I would say that it's quite the opposite. The technology is a microkernel design. I've already made a separate speech about this one. It's called the Linux sucks because it's monolithic speech. In that speech I describe in very poor detail. That's not really a high quality speech. But anyway, I talk about how the Linux kernel is monolithic and that's bad. So yeah, the Hurd kernel, it is a microkernel design. So there are already some inherent advantages to that are superior to the Linux kernel. So cast away those short-sighted fools who can't see the technological superiority of the Hurd kernel, and just let's look at the fact that if the future has the Hurd kernel come out of the developmental stages and have a release version, it doesn't really matter how long it takes. The moment there is a release version and some distributions of the GNU operating system, such as Debian and GUIX, the moment they adopt that and make it an official release version and push it as like their default choice and like all that stuff, you know, the moment that happens, there it is. It doesn't matter how long it took to get here, because here we are. Then, you know, let's say it's 5 years now, 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now. It doesn't really matter. When it happens, then there it is. And that's an option. That's an operating system you can use. And, you know, it has some really serious advantages to using a monolithic kernel. So it has some technological superiority. And even the other options I mentioned in FreeBSD and the other BSDs and the illumos, they are all they are all monolithic. They are all monolithic software kernels. So they are all monolithic kernels, so none of them have the advantages of being a microkernel. I'm not going to get too deep into the microkernel's advantages, but, you know, especially for those hobbyist types and people who really like to tinker with computers and software, very low level especially, you know, you could write your own drivers and software in user space and then just have them run and just experiment with it. You could like communicate with the hardware directly, like with your own software, and do all kinds of interesting things. You know, so I could see this appealing really a lot to, for example, all these like technology enthusiasts, specifically in like computer science, like wanting to do all that stuff. You know, you could do all kinds of awesome things. You know, you could write your own file system in user space and just have that run, and then just assign some hard drive, connect that to the computer, and then just have your custom driver run on that hard drive. You could implement your own file system. Like, how cool is that? Like, that would... I can see that appealing really a lot to people who would be interested in that sort of thing. You know, I could see myself being interested in that sort of thing. Quite a lot indeed. You know, I've done some programming as a hobby. Like, my interest is computers as a hobby. I like to work with computers just for the fun of it. Indeed, all these programming projects and such that I have done myself, you know, it is all just for my own, it's a leisure activity, basically. Leisure activity. It's a hobby. Yeah, I'm not interested in really working with computers as a profession of any kind, really. I don't know, I guess I could do something like that in the future or something, whatever, who knows. But primarily, computers to me are a hobby, so I could definitely see the sort of hobbyist types really adopt the Hurd kernel and start using it for all kinds of interesting things. You know, I'm in full support of putting the Hurd kernel as a high priority for development and such. Now, my skills are nowhere near enough to contribute to something like that at this time, but anyway, Hurd kernel, that thing, that poses a big competitor. to the Linux kernel. It is a really serious competitor then, when it comes out. And also, well, even in its current state, let's look at the Debian, incorrectly titled Debian GNU/Hurd. That should be just called Debian GNU, because Hurd is already the kernel of GNU, so there's no reason to specify the Hurd in the name like Debian GNU Hurd. There's no reason to specify the Hurd there. Anyway, Debian Vanilla GNU, it has the Hurd kernel. It's already usable. Like, I've made that two-parter video release on YouTube. I released it as a single video on Odyssey actually, but who cares about the way I released it? I've already made that content about the Debian GNU Hurd in 2023. And it's basically a usable system already. You know, the issues with that, in that video, all the issues shown, compatibility of software in the repository. I installed PCManFM and it didn't launch. But I installed other software like GIMP and HTOP and whatever else. I don't really remember off the top of my head anymore, but I installed software from the repository. Some of it worked and some of it didn't. Well, that's just a matter of, compatibility. You have to port the software to that environment, to that platform. So, that takes people to work on that and contribute to that and do all that maintaining stuff. Porting them and maintaining that stuff. So, if those people do their thing, and then some drivers and such are ported, well, I don't really know if they would be ported, but I guess someone could look at the drivers made for the Linux kernel and just get inspired by them, and then write drivers for the Hurd kernel, and maybe even some companies someday might release some drivers as Hurd kernel compatibles. Who knows? But if enough of that happens, that's just a matter of getting the people to contribute their software to the platform. So if that happens, then Hurd will be a really usable system, and it could have some really interesting use cases. They could be seen as niche, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because do keep in mind, many of the people on the GNU+Linux operating system are already into a niche as compared to the vast majority of the population in general. People for the most part just use like whatever Windows or Mac OS or Chrome OS or some nonsense like that, So already the GNU+Linux users are enthusiasts. So I could definitely see a big part of them already being potentially interested in something like Hurd. Now, like I have mentioned, that at its current state, the Hurd isn't ready, and it's still under development. So the short-sighted fools might ignore it. But I already said this. Once it comes out, then there it is. So it doesn't really matter how long it took to get there. Once it's out, and it's there, it's usable, and people can start using it, and there it is, the superior technology, a microkernel design, and yeah, it's also under a copyleft license. And not only that, it's under GPL version 3. So it's even more copyleft than the GPL version 2 of the Linux kernel. So the licensing stuff that I talked about earlier and the permissive versus copyleft stuff, yeah, Hurd is licensed under a copyleft license. Hurd is very copyleft. That combined with the other GNU software and software with the Debian software and GUIC software and all that stuff, that's some really copylefted stuff right there, and that's gonna force some people to make their developments and contributions and such public. They're gonna have to share their source code. Yes. They're gonna be forced to contribute their source code modifications. Yeah, that's gonna be some good stuff. I can definitely see a future where the Hurd kernel becomes a really big thing. There's a lot of these big things that it depends on. It depends on being that having it happen that people show interest in that, and the software and all the contributions are made to it, all the porting of the software to that platform, that needs to be done by someone. Many people, but anyway. When that happens, if that happens, then Hurd can be a really big thing. And because of the superior technology, it might really go really far. One day, someday, somewhere in the future. Because it is inherently superior. The technology is better. So, if it gets the contributions, if things go just right, in the happenings of history, if the things go just right, some company might adopt the Hurd kernel because it fits some niche use case, because it's microkernel, and then they start using it and it becomes like a big popular thing, and like, things could happen. The Linux kernel came out of nowhere and took over the world. So things like that can just happen. And because the Hurd kernel is technologically superior, who is to say that the Hurd kernel doesn't just take over the world the same way? It can happen. It definitely can. Most certainly it can. Linux kernel already did it. So it can definitely be done. So you can't ignore the Hurd because it has taken a long time to get developed. That would be foolish to make such a mistake, to ignore the Hurd. Anyway, I can definitely see a possible, really bright future for the Hurd kernel. So that's the final third option. And because we are talking about a possible future where the Linux kernel goes bad and you have to switch to other things, well, that is a future, that is predicting a future, so I might as well predict the Hurd kernel rising in popularity at the same time. Yeah, why not? Just throw that in there. It can be ignored, just like you cannot ignore the possibility that Linux kernel goes bad. People might take that Linux kernel and take that into a really bad direction. Yeah, also interest in it might fade over time. Perhaps all the big tech corporations that right now support it might one day just decide not to do so anymore. Anything can happen. Anything can happen, really. Well, would it be enough to just lose the support? Well, not really, because there are already these other kernels like the illumos kernel that doesn't really get much contributions. But it also has hardware issues. So, Linux kernel itself could become one day like illumos is today. It doesn't really run on that many hardwares, and it lacks drivers, and contributions are not that many, and there are not that many softwares available. So Linux could really get into that state someday in the future. That's possible. So what are the options? What to do then? Yeah, well, there's the three options. There's the BSD stuff, but it could be something else, and more likely, the bigger issue here this speech is actually about is if it goes bad. This speech is more specifically about, like, taking it into the wrong direction, making it bad. Maybe there's some proprietary software included in there or something. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about mainly in this speech. But yeah, just to say that, like, anything is possible. So you can't predict the future, and you cannot rely and assume that the Linux kernel will always be there and work like you want it to work. Yeah, anyway. So I think that's that for this speech then. Yeah, thanks for listening. Bye.